Okay, so the context for this discussion tonight is the beginnings of a new movement against war, which has been sparked in Australia by the AUKUS agreement between Australia, the US, and Britain, and the plan to buy nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. Now, a lot of the anger about AUKUS has been framed as the Australian government sucking up to America, surrendering American sovereignty, as one speaker in a recent forum put it, giving the US military command over these new submarines. As another speaker said, this is just a replay of nuclear colonialism with Australia as the nuclear colony. But it goes beyond that, because many of the best people who criticise AUKUS have argued that instead of AUKUS, Australia needs an independent foreign policy. And Solidarity rejects the call for an independent foreign policy, and that's essentially what I'm going to go over tonight. In brief, because it implies that Australia's foreign policy is being dictated to by its imperial allies, originally Britain and since the 1950s the USA. This is absolutely not true. Australia has now and has always had a relatively independent foreign policy. And I say relatively independent because no country has a completely independent foreign policy. Their foreign policies always are shaped under the pressure of allies, opponents, different regimes, and so on. We reject the suggestion too, implied in this, that the Australian state is weak and dominated by Washington. Australia is a major power in the region and a bully and exploiter in the region. And the call for an independent foreign policy inherently downplays this reality. And we also reject the call for an independent foreign policy because we reject the nationalist politics that are involved. They disorient activists and they're dangerous in their logic. So the first thing I want to do is just go through the empirical, if you like, the empirical situation. I want to start with Vietnam, the Vietnam War. Because when the Menzies government, Menzies was the Prime Minister at the time, committed Australian troops to the war in Vietnam in 1965, almost everyone on the left saw it as another example of Australian lives being sacrificed in interests of American imperialism. Another example of Australian soldiers fighting another country's wars. So to give you some examples, the Queensland Secretary of the Seamen's Union. The decision to send the troops was taken on the orders of the US government. The Secretary of the Railways Union. No one can deny that the USA put pressure on the Australian government to increase our commitment. The leader of the Communist Party, Laurie Ahrens. Menzies finally surrendered the last shred of independence in foreign policy. Lionel Murphy, a more mainstream figure and later a High Court judge, at the time the Labor Party leader in the Senate, 1971, we are involved because the US government decided we should be involved. Every single one of these statements is untrue, absolutely untrue. And the truth about Australia's involvement in Vietnam was outlined decades ago in a very, very important book called War for the Asking by Michael Cathcart, which, you know, I just think is something every socialist should read. So Cathcart wrote that initially it was seen, this commitment to fight in Vietnam was seen as a response to American pressure. But after going through all the documents that were available, he concluded that beyond doubt, the real initiative did not come from the Americans, but from the Australians. The Australian government, he wrote, was totally indifferent to the aims and expectations of the South Vietnamese government. Not only was a South Vietnamese invitation to send troops to the war not sought until the last minute, which means days before the announcement, but the Australian government was determined that troops should go even if the South Vietnamese did not want them and had to be coerced into taking them by the Americans. So what was the Menzies government trying to do? You know, because these are governments, you know, the famous situation, you know, all the way with LBJ, you know, the Harold Holt, his successor's famous statement, which made it seem like, you know, Australian foreign policy was being shaped by the Americans. Cathcart wrote that what a study of the available documents from that period reveals is that the Australian government desired an increased American involvement in the Vietnam conflict at every level and a significant Australian participation. These were Australian government aims even before the Americans had combat troops in Vietnam. Why? Because the Americans could be locked into Southeast Asia by their involvement in Vietnam, and that would be a good thing for Australia. And the context for this is, of course, the Cold War between the US and the US alliances, the NATO, and the Soviet Union. And this rivalry, this confrontation was primarily focused in Europe. So the Australian government was seeking to drag the US into a war in Southeast Asia, where America was not indifferent, but not, heavily engaged. And Australian participation would oblige America to help if Australia was threatened. Now, I start with that because the facts are so clearly stated. To make a more general point, which is that what Cathcart described is the enduring dynamic of Australian foreign policy from the very beginning, i.e. the dynamic being to drag an imperial power into the region, or if they're there, keep them engaged here. And this was the dynamic from the very earliest days of self-government in the Australian colonies after Britain withdrew its own military in 1870. So, for instance, there were demands by various colonies that Britain colonised Fiji, Vanuatu, PNG, demands that Britain keep the French, the Germans, the Russians and others out of the Western Pacific. And when Britain refused to colonise New Guinea and the German government colonised the northern half of what we now call New Guinea, there was outrage in the Australian colonies. The most respectable elements of the ruling class ran these gigantic mass meetings of absolute outrage, condemning Britain for its betrayal of imperial interests and Australian interests, to the point where one of the leading figures in the colonial office in Britain said to one of the Australian premiers that he really thought that they were on the brink of losing the Australian colonies. That's how serious the crisis was. So that was the dynamic. It wasn't that Britain was pushing its way into the Pacific, it was that the Australian government wanted to drag them in. In the 1930s, Australia's, in a sense, military policy was constant pressure on Britain to maintain and strengthen its naval base at Singapore. Now, Singapore is not a suburb of Brisbane, right? It's someone else's land. It was a colony of Britain, and a very unpleasant one as well. Australian policy was we want British imperialism in the region. And when the Japanese military overran Singapore in 1942, Paul Keating's response to that, many years later, decades later, in the 1980s, was this one is an example of Britain betraying Australia by not defending its empire in Singapore. In 1951, Australia signed the ANZUS Treaty with the US. Again, the rhetoric around this is this was for the Americans. The reality was that Australia demanded a treaty with the United States as its price for going along with a peace treaty with Japan. So I think this gives you a sense of a continuity of Australian foreign policy. Conservative historian Greg Pemberton, in his study of the origins of Australia's involvement in Vietnam, wrote that Australia's strategic and economic interests demanded that Western hegemony be maintained in Southeast Asia. And what was true 50, 60 years ago continues to be true today. So just briefly want to say why I think this dynamic has been so enduring. Well, partly, of course, it's a reflection of the shall we say, the enduring logic of imperial rivalry. But I think there's some specific factors at work. We frequently describe Australia as a colonial settler state. But Australia, as a colonial settler state, has its own very specific features. And one of those features is that the Australian state, well, originally the British Empire, but then subsequently the Australian state has seized a vast landmass, an entire continent, And it's done so with a relatively tiny settler population. It's built an economy, the ruling class has built an economy reliant on the great economic powers for both markets and for capital. Now, Australia's geographic position and so on means it is essentially secure from conflict with poor states, but it lacks the wealth and population, the industrial infrastructure to defend all parts of the landmass and surrounding oceans from rival great powers. On top of that, the part of Australia that's closest to the rest of the world, to other states, Northern Australia is the part of Australia that is largely unsettled in the colonial, if you like, capitalist sense. And so I call this condition being a relatively unsettled colonial settler state. And it's shaped the strategies of the Australian state since before Federation. White Australia, protectionism, immigration, industry policy, imperial alliances, all aspects of Australian policy have been shaped by this particular feature. Now, the strategy of dragging an imperial protector into the region and keeping them engaged doesn't mean that Australian governments have simply done what the great power wanted. And so I'm going to briefly go over some examples of to give you a sense of the independence of Australian foreign policy. So, for instance, in the late 1880s, Australian colonial governments, in a unified act, passed laws excluding Chinese immigrants. Now, Britain did not like this. This significantly complicated Britain's relationship with the Chinese government, which it wanted as an ally in its global rivalry with the Russian Empire. And in particular to assist in its defence of India. But they did it anyway. In the 1910s, the new Labor government set up an independent Australian Navy. And some of the things it did in that regard were over the objections of the British. In the First World War, the Australian government refused to allow the British military to run court-martials of Australian troops. Not least because they opposed the death penalty for in those court-martials. At the Versailles Conference after the First World War, Australia's Prime Minister, one of the most objectionable human beings to ever inhabit the continent, William Morris Hughes, created a rift between Britain and its ally Japan by hysterically campaigning against the insertion of a clause against racial discrimination in the Charter of the League of Nations. Britain wanted a closer alliance with Japan, and Hughes created this amazing rift with his campaigning against any talk of opposition to racial discrimination. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the wartime Prime Minister John Curtin declared war on Japan. Britain had not done so. So he independently declared war on Japan. Then in 1942, when Japan took Singapore, in that context, there were Australian troops coming back from the Middle East. The British government wanted those troops sent to Burma, to Myanmar, to bolster the British military in Burma and to defend India from any advance by the Japanese. Curtin refused to allow them to do it and forced the British government, to allow those troops to come back to Australia. And this was a massive rift within that alliance. And we can go to more recent examples. The Howard government fought for China's admission to the World Trade Organization in, I think it was 2001, over American objections. Tony Abbott, people may remember Tony Abbott, who's just been to Taiwan to tell Taiwanese people something they didn't know, hosted Xi Jinping in the Australian Parliament, something that's an honour that's only been granted to a tiny handful of foreign butchers, exploiters, and thugs like him. So, and Americans didn't like this. There's a whole range of, these little things that don't necessarily come out in public much. So there's countless examples of Australia asserting its independence from American foreign policy. Okay, so why does it matter? Why is this left nationalist argument that Australia needs a independent foreign policy, that it shouldn't be a slave to American policy, which of course is untrue. Why is this a problem? It promotes the illusion that the Australian state can and might actually protect ordinary Australians, whereas in fact it's the greatest threat to our interests and well-being. It hides the nature and power of the ruling class here and the reality of Australian imperialism. It legitimises the Australian military. What is a foreign policy without a military? And it radically undermines our ability to build an effective movement against war. And that's because the whole logic of left nationalism is to seek alliances with elements of the ruling class who disagree with the policy. So I just want to briefly go over, I know I'm running out of time, so I might just go over one example. The Labor Party was crucial in the founding of the Australian Navy. When the Labor government of 1910 to 1913 founded the Australian Navy, the existing arrangement was that the Australian government paid the British government a subsidy for keeping ships in the Australian arena, but they were under the control of the British Navy. In 1909, there was a massive scare about German military hardware building, the expansion of German militarism, and so on. And the minority Labor government of 1908 to 1909 faced a massive campaign from the ruling class to raise money to offer to pay for a new dreadnought, a major battleship for the British government. Now, the Labor government at the time just said, basically, go and get stuffed. We're not doing this. Our policy is to establish an independent Australian Navy. And, of course, the Conservatives said, you don't care about the empire and so on. And sure enough, the Labor government not only founded the Australian Navy, but insisted that only Australian taxpayers would pay for that Navy to ensure its independence. So here we have an example of that kind of vaguely lefty nationalism standing up to what was seen at the time as the demands of the empire. So what happened? That Navy was built. Some of it was ready for the First World War. So what was the first thing that Navy did? The first thing that happened, of course, is that in the election that brought Labor back to office on the eve of the war, Andrew Fisher, the Labor leader, promised to defend the British Empire to the last man and the last shilling. So this was in the context of a war, this was the politics of the nationalist Labor Party leader. The first thing that Navy did was to go to war against the German Navy in the Pacific and to seize all of Germany's colonies south of the equator. So exactly what did the Australian Navy help the Australian state seize in 1914? Well, it seized the northern half of what we now call New Guinea, which was German colony. Then there was the Bismarck Archipelago. So what were some of the islands in the Bismarck Archipelago that the Navy seized? Well, one of them is called Bougainville. Does anyone know the history of Bougainville? Another one of those islands was an island called Manus Island. And then, of course, it went a bit further south and seized another little island, German possession, called Nauru. So this was what this independent naval force set up actually did in 1914. And that kind of logic, nationalism leading to actual, not just material support for imperialism, but for Australia, this projection of the Australian state's power in the region, that's what it led to. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the way that left nationalism led to the Communist Party of Australia being a conservative force in the anti-Vietnam movement. I'm sure there's plenty of people who may be able to raise some of those issues. Because that was the dynamic of left nationalism. So I just want to finish up by saying that the context in which we're discussing this is the Australian government preparing for war with China. And here's what I think the problem is. If you believe that China is some kind of strategic military threat to Australia, if you believe that Australia has to prepare to confront China, you can oppose the subs. you can oppose AUKUS, but you still want to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on different submarines, fighter planes, and other weapons, which is really essentially the position of someone like, say, Rex Patrick or Paul Keating. You may not want total integration with the American military, but you will want to create alliances with other powers in the region, including other major powers, Japan and India, not to mention the French and British Empire. But of course, because the US is the most powerful force in the region, you or your supporters will inevitably be dragged into cooperation with American imperialism. And so, in other words, if you want Rex Patrick or Kevin Rudd or Malcolm Turnbull or Paul Keating as part of your movement, you will be driven to resist any attempt to make it a movement against war with China. And I think we've already seen that logic playing out. And so we reject left nationalism. We reject left nationalism because we understand that preparing for is not only barbaric and potentially catastrophic for humanity, but because we understand that the imperialist war is the final high point of capitalist competition. Left nationalism essentially says we have something in common with the people who exploit us, who oppress us, who fill our newspapers with rubbish, and who do everything possible to keep us under control and in order and so on, and whose real aim is to supplant their rival thugs, the rival bullies, the ones that they see as standing in their way of greater wealth and greater power. And our future depends on stopping this and building a movement that can break their power over us once and for all.